There are two major models for how speciation might occur. One is called Allopatric speciation. The other is called Sympatric speciation. So in both cases, we start with a parent population, in this case, golden mosquito fish. And you can see they live in the same pond, they're interbreeding, so on and so forth. That's a population. Remember, a population is a group of the same species in the same area that can interbreed. Okay, so an interbreeding group of the same species. And allopatric speciation, allo means other, and patric means country. Like the word patriotism comes from that. Okay, so this means the fish get divided into two different places. So in this case, a barrier arises that separates the fish into two different populations. So we now have, let's just call it population A and B. And in population A, maybe there are different predators or different food sources, and population B is a little bit different from population A. And the fish adapt to those two different conditions. And each of these two populations have their own unique mutations that make them a little bit different over time. Not just adaptations, but slightly different mutations here and there, making them a little bit different. They have slightly different behaviors, so on and so forth. And over time, speciation occurs. And we now have two different species of fish instead of just two different populations. Now, sympatric speciation means same country. This is when they're all in the same environment, but for some reason, there's a speciation event. In the case of the fish, perhaps a few of the fish are blue because of a mutation in the population. And what might happen there is then sexual selection. So bluefish might only mate with bluefish, and the goldfish don't want to mate with the bluefish, and therefore they start separating over time, even in the same population. And you have different mutations accumulating in the bluefish than the yellowfish, different traits accumulating, and they become more and more different over time. And then you have two different species that evolved in the same habitat. That's sympatric speciation. Okay, so we can see here an example of allopatric speciation where they've actually seen this at the Grand Canyon, where there are chipmunks or ground squirrels on each side of the Grand Canyon. They originally were a single population. They got separated around the Grand Canyon. They each adapted to the different conditions on either side, and they have diverged into different species. Different selective pressures led to different phenotypes, and therefore eventually they don't breed with each other even when they encounter each other. By different selective pressures, we mean different drivers of natural selection. So different food sources, different predators, different habitats, things like that. So they've adapted to different conditions, and they've become different, both genetically and phenotypically. Now, when you have this occur, when you have a population, so here we have some populations that are interbreeding, but right here is some kind of barrier, like a mountain or a canyon or whatever, and the populations get separated from one another. And these organisms on the top are adapting to their new conditions, and they're changing. The populations diverge. They're becoming more different. Now, eventually they get around that barrier, and then some of them might venture off this way, and some of these might venture down here, and they might interbreed. They might still be able to interbreed and produce hybrids. So what happens is you have a whole bunch of, let's just call this species A up here and species B down here. And in between here, you have a lot of hybrids between the two species, assuming they can still produce hybrids, right? And there are really three possibilities as to what might happen in the future then when this occurs after allopatric speciation has occurred. One, you can see here they call it reinforcement. This is when hybrids die out. The hybrids are maybe not viable, or they're not fertile or not very fertile, right? And over time, they don't really work out. They die out. And that means that population A and B become more different. They maintain their differences. The difference is reinforced. And they're on their way to being completely different species, right? Another thing that could happen is gene flow between A and B. genes might get into the hybrids and come back to A and go from A into the hybrid zone and back to B. And what might happen is the opposite of speciation, where the two groups that seem to be becoming new species fuse back together. And that is called fusion, the weakening of the barriers between the two species. The last thing that might happen is stability. This is when you still maintain species A and B, if we're going to call them species here, and the hybrid zone is also maintained. So that could occur when A and B tend to breed with each other every now and again and produce hybrids, and the hybrids breed mostly only with other hybrids. So hybrids breed with hybrids for the most part. So you don't get a lot of gene flow between A and B. B might reproduce with A, producing a hybrid, but the hybrid tends to only breed with other hybrids, okay? And that's when you have what they call stability, when you maintain the hybrid zone, and A and B are also maintained, stability, okay? Those are the three major things that could happen in those cases of sympatric speciation when the two species meet back up again. Another kind of sympatric speciation is called adaptive radiation. And actually, you could consider this almost a form of sympatric and allopatric, I guess, depending on how you think about it. But the important thing is the concept of adaptive radiation. So this is when you have a population on the mainland, like in South America here, you have a population, and over here is an island, and some of these end up out here on the island, kind of like the finches in the Galapagos. The finches on the mainland eat seeds, but they end up on different islands where there are different food sources. And some of them adapt to eat leaves, some of them adapt to eat insects, some of them eat grubs, some of them eat fruit, and they all develop different characteristics, and it happens somewhat quickly. They end up on these islands, and there were no other birds on the island. There was no competition. And so this happens a lot after extinctions, when someone survives the extinction and they radiate rapidly and evolve rapidly into lots of different species, or when a species ends up in a new habitat like an island and there are vacant niches. A niche is kind of like a role in the environment, like, hey, there's no one on this island that eats these fruits, or there's no one on this island that eats these bugs. There's no competition. And so the birds rapidly radiate into new species, taking those roles. There's an example of this in places, I think it was like Jamaica and I can't remember where all the Cuba and a few other places where this study was done, where these anole lizards were seen on these different islands. And so let's just look at one island here where one of these lizards, or maybe a pregnant, a fertilized female washed up on shore at some point, right? One lizard or two lizards ended up on this island. And then on this island now we have all these different species, but they're all descended from this one founding member or a couple of founding members. What happens is there was no lizards on the island. So some of these lizards, all these babies hatched and they adapted over time, over generations. And some of them now live up here in the top of the tree. Some of them live down here, and some of them live on the side of the tree, and some of them live in the grasses now, and they eat different foods, they have different behaviors, and they've rapidly radiated into new species in this vacant island where there was maybe not very many predators and no competition for food. So that's called adaptive radiation. Now let's focus on how sympatric speciation might occur. Especially in these examples. This happens in some animals, but this is more common in plants. This is a condition known as polyploidy. Sorry about that. Polyploidy. So haploid N, diploid 2N. Polyploidy could be 4N or 16N. Usually if an animal is 4N, it doesn't survive development. It doesn't hatch or it's not born. But plants often can survive this condition, and it causes them to become new species. It can. So let's look at an example known as autopolyploidy. Auto means self polyploidy. So here we have an example of a plant cell that's diploid. 2N is 6, but it has an error in meiosis or mitosis. So instead of 2N is 6, it's now 4N. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. 4N of 12, right? Now, this species undergoes meiosis to make gametes, and these gametes are 2N, right? Because this one's 4N, half of 4N is 2N. So it undergoes meiosis, 2N. When these fuse together, you have 4N again. And so this 4N species cannot breed with the species that gave rise to it. So because of this error, when we produce this cell, and by cell, let's assume this is a fertilized egg that grew up to be an adult, right? And then that adult makes gametes, and those gametes lead to a new organism. This is a new species of 4N. It's a tetraploid, and it's therefore considered a new species. So autopolyploidy is when there's an error in copying of the cell, resulting in extra copies of a chromosome, and therefore, the eggs or sperm of this species that are 2N will typically not fuse with normal eggs and sperm from this cell, which would just be N, right? They won't fuse together, therefore they are different species now. And lots of plant species have been seen to undergo this form of speciation, even in the last 100 years. Another example of polyploidy is called allopolyploidy, and once again, there's that word allo, means other polyploidy. So in this case, we have a species 2N of 6 and another species 2N of 4, and they make normal gametes, N equals 3 for this one, N equals 2 for this one. They fuse together, making a sterile hybrid called, so it's a hybrid that survived, but we're just going to say it's only got 5 chromosomes in it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. N of 5, right? Because 3 plus 2 is 5. So it's not really diploid because its chromosomes don't have partners. But it might still survive because plants can do that. All right, so N of 5. Now, if this cell has an error in its replication, so first of all, it can't make seeds, for example. Let's say it's a seed plant. It can't make seeds because it doesn't have partners for its chromosomes. It doesn't have homologous chromosomes. It can't do meiosis. So this is how like a banana works that doesn't have seeds. Banana. Banana. Oh, okay. Let's not spell words today. All right. So, bananas might work this way. Okay. That's why there's not seeds in a typical banana. They're grown asexually. But let's say this plant has an error in mitosis or meiosis, and it doubles its chromosomes. Now everyone does have a partner. We're 2N of 10. And this is now a new species that cannot breed back with this species anymore. And so this is a new species formed by the hybridization of 2 other species and then a copying of chromosomes. This is called an allopolyploid, meaning a polyploid, extra copies of chromosomes from 2 different species, leading to a new species of plant in this case. Pretty cool. Now, lastly, I want to end this lecture with a quick talk about how fast is evolution. And the fossil record, if you look at it, often shows sudden appearances and disappearances of species. But remember that rock layers often represent millions of years, so sudden is a relative term. There are 2 models of how evolution might work. One is the Darwinian approach called gradualism, which is slow, steady change with lots of intermediate forms, right? But the other model, called punctuated equilibria, or sometimes punctuated equilibrium, proposed by Eldridge and Gould, they think that organisms, once they evolve, stay the same for a long, long time and then evolve quickly into new species. And that's called punctuated equilibrium. And so once a species evolve, they don't change much, and then they accumulate changes very rapidly. And likely not very many of those have a chance to be fossilized because they're not around for long. And so in the fossil record, they appear to evolve very rapidly with very few transitional forms. And so we can see these models here, the punctuated pattern where the species evolves rapidly and has long time of stasis where they don't change very much. Or the gradual pattern where there's tons of gradual changes from one species to the next. And it seems that perhaps both of these models are correct, depending on the species and depending on the situation. And you can read a little more about that in your textbook. I don't want to make this video too long, but I want you to be familiar with the 2 models of evolution. All right, so that wraps up everything you need for Exam 1. And make sure to do those guided readings, and you'll be in good shape.